What should we do with the value objects we created in the previous part? Let's group them together into entities representing a note and a to-do item. Hello, welcome to ResoCoder, where you are getting prepared for real app development so that you will get freelance clients or a job and be confident about the apps you build. So subscribe and hit the bell to join us on our quest for becoming in-demand Flutter developers. In this tutorial, we are going to take all of these value objects, which are node body, to-do name, node color, and list of 3 items, and put them into entities. Entities are basically a group of value objects which has an identity which is going to be given by the unique identifier which we have created a while back. The unique identifier is actually here in core, unique ID value object. Every single entity will be identified by its value, which is of course unique, as it says in the name of the value object itself. And in the case of Firestore database, we are going to use this unique ID as also the document ID inside Firestore. But that's going to come later on in this tutorial series. For now, let's focus on the domain layer by creating entities. So let us first create the node entity, and then we are also going to have the to-do item entity. So we are going to create a new file under nodes domain. Let's call it node.dart, and this is where the entity is going to be present. It's gonna be very similar to the user entity. So basically it's a freezed class. It's going to be a data class, and there are going to be a few more fancy things added on top of that. So let's get started. We're going to create fData class using the code snippet. And you can, by the way, also get this code from the link in the video description. Let's call this node and import freezed annotation. And while we are at it, let's also open up the terminal and run our favorite build command, flutter pub run build runner watch, delete conflicting outputs. And this command is also available from the video description. Once we have this watch command running, we can go ahead and actually start putting all of the needed value objects into the node data class. So the first one is the unique ID by which each individual instance of the node class will be identified. So it will be required parameter, unique ID. Let's call it ID. And of course, it wouldn't hurt if we actually provided a freezed part statement. So node.freeze.dart is the part. And let's actually make this into a named parameter with the curly braces. Now we are talking. So this is not something specific to the node feature of the app. Unique ID is just always present, no matter which entity we are currently creating. What's important about the node is that it should hold a node body, and node body will be nothing else than our beloved node body value object, which we have created in the previous part. So let's call it body. Then similarly, we should have at required node color. Let's call it color. And let's check out the value objects which are still left out. So we have node body, we don't have to-do name, we have node color, and we don't have this list of 3 items. So we are still not using 2 of the value objects which we should use. Those are list of 3 items and then also to-do name. Well, we know that each and every node should have a list of at most 3 to-dos. So can we do something like add required, then list 3 and to-do name, to-dos? Well, we can do something like this, but then the problem arises that these to-dos cannot be completed because this list 3 of to-do name has no concept of a done or undone to-do. It just holds basically what is a validated string of a to-do name. But we need to provide a way to complete or uncomplete the given to-do. That's why we are going to create yet another entity, and this one is going to be called to-do item. So let's go ahead, new file, to-do item.dart. And over here, it's again going to be a freezed data class. So we're going to create a part statement for the freezed package, and then also fData class to do item. Let's import freezed. And now we need to provide the fields even to this data class. And it's going to be precisely over here where we should include the to-do name as one of the fields of the to-do item. So add required to-do name, name. Let's import the value objects.dart. Of course, even a to-do item is an entity, so it should be identified separately. In this case, theoretically, we can leave out the unique ID because to-do item is really just a part of a node. So technically, those to-dos could be just identified by the node ID as a whole, but let's just include the unique ID even inside the to-do item. It's not going to hurt for sure. And then also what we came here for is the ability to mark our to-dos as done. So complete them, in other words. So again, required. And this is going to be just a simple bool, done. So unlike all of the other fields which are held inside an entity, which are value objects like node body, node color, list 3, and so on, the done field is just a simple bool, and the reason for that is also very simple. How can you actually validate a boolean? Sure, for now you can make the boolean to be null. In just a little while, when the non-nullable types arrive into Dart, even that thing will be not possible. So one less thing to worry about. But if we discard the possibility to set done as null, like this, of course, in pseudocode, if we discard this, then there is nothing else we can practically validate when it comes to a simple true or false boolean. So that's why we are not wrapping this inside any sort of a value object. Now that we have the to-do item, we can go ahead into the node and store it inside the list of 3 items. So let's say to-do item. And just like this, we have basically a nested entity inside the list. If we wanted to build just a bare bones data holder class, we would call it a day right now, because everything that's needed to hold these value objects inside a data class is already here. But we want to make our lives easier in the future, and that's why we are going to provide some helper factories and also getters or other properties which are going to allow us to write code more quickly in the future parts, that is. So the first thing we are going to add to our entities are empty factories. Because think about it, when you open up a new screen that you want to create a new node, you need to have an empty node body. A certain default node color will be selected, and you are going to have 0 to-do items added to the node. So that's going to be sort of the empty state, let's say, of a node. Empty body, predefined color will be selected, and the list of to-dos will be empty by default. So let's create a factory, node.empty, and let's just say that it is going to return a node, and it's going to simply populate the ID with a new unique ID. Then body will be node body, and we are going to pass in an empty string with 0 characters. Then color, this is where things get interesting, will be node color, and node color value object takes in a color, and we are going to select it from the predefined colors which we have created in the previous part right here, and we are going to select the first, so that is the canvas color. So we're going to say node color dot predefined colors 0, so the first one, and lastly to-dos. This is a list 3, and this takes in nothing else than a KT list, so the immutable Kotlin fake list, or fake Kotlin list. The list is not fake, only the Kotlin is sort of fake. So we want to do something like this, an empty list, but the way you do this with the KT Dart package is by saying empty list. Simple as that. So we have just imported KT Dart over here, of course without a semicolon at the end. And this is what's needed in order to produce the default empty node, which will be present when we open up the node form for the first time. Similar to this, we also want to have an empty factory for whenever we add a new to-do item inside the node creation form in the UI. So in order to simplify the process of creating a new empty to-do, again, we are going to have factory to-do item dot empty, and we're just going to instantiate a to-do item, and we're going to again provide the ID to be a new unique ID, which is going to be generated from the UUID package. Then name will be to-do name, an empty string will be passed in there, and lastly done will be false by default. All right, so we have the empty factories done. So what is next? When I open up the app and open up the node creation form like this, and I hit this check mark to basically add the node to the database, we are going to get an error message under the node body saying that it cannot be empty, and the same would go also for the to-dos, and we cannot add more than 3 to-dos and so on. So that's all nice. But the thing is that these error messages are coming from the individual value objects. For example, from the node body value object, from the list 3 value object, and also from the to-do name value object. But how can we validate the whole entity at once? Currently, we can validate value objects just fine, and that's awesome, but we have no way of validating the whole entity. That means combining the validation results of all of its value objects, and if all are valid, then the whole entity is valid. If just one value object is invalid, that means that the whole entity is also invalid. So how can we do that? And actually, I will show you why we are going to validate the whole entity at once. It surely is a bit of an overkill, but again, we are building the most awesome secure application that has ever been built. So yeah, that's why we need to have this sort of a validation in place. The easiest way for me to demonstrate what we want to happen whenever an invalid data somehow manages to get into our entities is by modifying the Firestore database. And although I know that the online or remote database should in fact be the single source of truth, and client code should not even really worry about validating the data that comes from the database, again, we are pretending that we are building the most secure application, space launch or cancer treatment. We cannot afford any bugs. We cannot afford any possible ways of tampering with the data. So we need to validate both on the client side and on the server side, and everything just needs to be fully secure. So if I go ahead and find the correct user and I edit a note, for example, this one, right? This is the note which we can see on the screen. This is the red note. But when I edit it over here, for example, I will make one of the to-do items to be empty. So it's no longer going to say learn about Socrates, but it's going to say basically nothing, so it's going to be empty. And I update the field. Now when I go over to the app, I can see invalid note. Please contact support. Details for nerds. Value failure string empty. Failed value empty string, basically. So as you can see, we just cannot even see the invalid note in our UI. And technically what we could do then is create some sort of a reporting system where if we click on this invalid note in the UI, it would open up some support client, or for example, it would send an email to the application support team with the ID of the failed note, for example. So if we are building a fully secure app, this is the way to go. Now I have reverted the name back to learn about Socrates, and just like that, we can again fully and properly see the note in the UI because there are no errors. So let's go ahead and implement this kind of a validation system for entities as a whole. So we're going to start off in the to-do item entity because it's simpler, and we want to create a member which is going to be a get only property called failure option. The problem is that we are inside a freezed data class, and there are some caveats which you need to know about when you want to add a custom function or a getter to a freezed data class or to a freezed union. That caveat is that you have to get rid of this mixin syntax. Instead, you are going to implement the $$ class, which is generated. And also you need to provide a empty default constructor. So to do item, and since we do not want it to be accessible from outside the to do item package, we're going to make it package private with an underscore. Now we are talking and we can add our field or property just fine. The way that we are going to report possible failures of the whole entity is by returning an option which will hold a value failure holding dynamic. We don't really care about what is inside the failure. We can make it dynamic, but we really do care about the actual failure being present. And it's going to be a get only property failure option. And we just basically want to return either some if there is some sort of a failure present among the value objects held inside the entity, or we are going to return none if all of the value objects are valid. Over here inside the to-do item entity, it's going to be very simple because we have really just one validated value object, and that is the to-do name. We really do not have to worry about unique ID. Technically, we could also include the unique ID in the validation thing, but as you can see over here in the definition of unique ID, it just cannot possibly be invalid because we never use the left side of either, so we just know it's always going to be valid. That's why we can leave it out. So what do we want to return here? Name dot, and technically we could do something like value, and then we could do fold, and if there is some sort of a failure, so we are inside the left side of either, so if left arrives, which is a F failure, then we simply know that the whole entity is not valid. So we are going to return some failure, and pass in the actual failure, F. So we return option, which is a some failure. In our case, we can ignore the right value, which in this case is just a string because we are operating on a name, which is holding a string. And in case everything is valid, we are going to return none. So if everything is valid, we return option none failure, so no failure. And again, if you want to check out this code at your own pace, you can get it from the link in the video description. And this is good enough for this simple class. Once we get into validating the whole node entity, you are going to see that this kind of an approach may be problematic, and we are going to fix it. But for now, let's take a look at this squiggly line under the to-do item. It says that we should sort unnamed constructor declarations first. So we actually want to ignore this linter or this info message. So we're going to copy the name of the message, go over to analysis options YAML, and just paste it here and say ignore. And just like that, we're going to get rid of that message. And we do, which is nice. Now let's do the same validation thing also inside the node entity. So again, we are going to say implements instead of with, implements node. We're going to provide the const node private constructor, and we are going to also add the property called failure option. Let's import darts, let's import value failure, and let's implement the failure option, shall we? But over here, it's not going to be as simple as with the to-do item. That's because we have multiple value objects which can be invalid, and we need to chain them together. And if just single one of these value objects holds an invalid value, the whole entity is going to also be invalid. So let's go ahead and do what we can, right? Return body is the first validated value object. So we're going to say body value, and then we're going to say again fold, right? Well, no, we are not going to say fold, just as we did inside the to-do item straight away, because we need to combine other failures possibly too. If you remember in the previous part, inside the value objects right here, for example in to-do name, when we were trying to combine multiple validation functions together, which also just return either, we use something called flat map. And I told you that flat map works like a short-circuiting if statement, where if you have if false and true, this last true part is not even going to get evaluated, because when the first expression is false, the whole and expression is just by definition going to be false too. And here we used flat map for it, but now we are not going to use flat map because we don't actually want to map anything. We don't even really care about the value which is held inside the individual either object. We just care about if it's valid or not. In other words, if it's left or right of either. So instead of a flat map function, we are just going to use a and then function. So let's delete fold, and we are going to say and then, and provide the next thing which should be included in the validation chain. And just like flat map, if the first validated value is invalid, so it's left, then the whole chain will be basically just short-circuited, it will be skipped, and the whole entity will be thus immediately evaluated as invalid. So inside this and then, we want to provide the next thing which should be validated. So that is going to be to-dos and value, right? This to-dos.value will tell us, for example, if the to-do list somehow has more than 3 items. And then technically, if this was it, we could just say fold and do the same thing as we did inside the to-do item validation. So basically, if we receive something on the left side, some sort of a failure, we return that failure from the failure option. Otherwise, if everything is valid, we return none, which means no failure is present. The whole entity is thus valid. So we can copy this and paste it over to our node entity. But you probably see some problems arising here, and that's totally correct. We have red squiggly line under to-dos.value, and it says the argument type, either value failure kt list to do item, kt list to do item being the valid value, cannot be assigned to this thing, which is dynamic value. And also the second either's value failure holds a string, not a kt list to do item. We don't really care about the types held inside the value failure, and we don't even care about the valid values which are on the right side of either. Here, inside this failure option property, we just simply want to tell if the whole entity is valid or not. So how can we go about ignoring all of these kt lists and strings and just focusing on what's important, the left and right of either? Basically, we're going to discard all of the other types, which will allow us to use them together and not get any type argument errors. The way we can ignore all of these types, which we are not interested in, is by providing some sort of a mapping inside the value object base class. So let's go ahead into core value objects.dart, and here we have our default abstract class value object. And just like we have, for example, this is valid getter or method actually, we are going to add a failure or unit getter. Inside of this getter, failure or unit, we are going to get rid of all of the detailed types, and we are just going to focus on the left and right side of either. So it's going to return either for sure, and the left side will hold just a value failure, which is the universal superclass or the super union, if you will, of all the failures which we have inside value objects. So value failure, holding dynamic. We don't even care about the type of failure, we just care about the failure itself. And then we can completely and absolutely discard the right value of either by saying that it's unit. Okay, so from here, we can now just return value dot fold, and inside this fold, we are going to get rid of all of the non-important types. So we're going to return just a cast it left value failure dynamic. So basically we return the same value which has been passed in, but it's being passed in as value failure, let's say string, and it's coming out as value failure dynamic. So we just get rid of this type parameter, and then whenever something is correct on the right side of either, we want to return it as a unit. So if this comes in, this T type, generic type, is a string again, or it's a KT list, we're going to get rid of that type information by just saying that it's a unit. So not return, but write unit. Okay, and just like that, we have gotten rid of all of the things which prevent us from using different value objects in one validation chain. So now we can go ahead into the node.dart, and instead of saying body.value, we are going to say body.failure or unit, and again todo's failure or unit. And as you can see, we have gotten rid of the errors which were present here, because now we are always operating on value failure dynamic and unit, and no matter which value object we validate, its types for validation in this validation chain are going to be just the same. And while we were doing this failure or unit property conversion and these failure option getters, it may have been too abstract for you, but now that you see the outcome of it, hopefully you understand why we did what we did a while ago. And if you need to, feel free to re-watch the previous few minutes and you are going to grasp it much better. So we are validating the body and also the to-dos list, but we are only validating the to-dos list as list 3, meaning that if the to-dos list has more than 3 items, it's going to be invalid. But we also want to validate all of the actual to-do items which are held inside the list, not just the length of the list. So that's why we are going to add another and then function call, and inside of there we are going to validate all of the individual to-do items. This is going to get a bit lengthy, but it's definitely worth it. So we're going to say to-dos, and we want to get them or crash the app. And by this time, we know that get or crash will definitely not crash the app, because by the virtue of previously calling to-do's failure of unit, we know that if we get to the next and then call, the to-dos have to be valid, because if they weren't, we would not even get to this next and then chained call, because we would have short-circuited the validation chain, just like with the AND expressions in an if statement. It's the same thing. So that's why we can afford to call get or crash without having nightmares about it. So once we have the actual to-dos, the KT list of to-do items, now we want to get hold of the to-do items failure option. And in order to sort of extract something from a list of items, we can use the map function, and we want to map the items of the list, the to-do items. So let's say to-do item, and extract the to-do items failure option like this. Now, when is the whole to-do item invalid? It's invalid when the failure option is sum. In other words, when this thing has run. If there is some value in this failure option, it means that the whole to-do item is invalid. This means that we only care about the values of sum. So we're going to go ahead and say filter. This is, by the way, the same thing as calling where function on the regular Dart list. So we're going to filter by a predicate, which will say that the failure option O is sum. So what this is going to do is that we're going to have only the failed to-do items in this KT list returned by the filter method. So we now have inside this KT list only the failed to-do items. How can we tell if all of the values held inside the list of to-do items are invalid? Well, I will first write the code and then explain it. We want to say get or else on the index of 0, and if we cannot get this 0 index, meaning that there is no element present, then we're going to return none. Okay, so what are we doing here with this get or else? Well, if we cannot get the 0th item from this filtered list, which should contain only the failed to-do items, that means that there are no failed to-do items present, which in its logical conclusion means that all of the to-do items are valid. Or maybe there are even no to-do items to begin with, in which case, of course, the whole list is valid, because no to-do items means valid. Nodes don't necessarily have to have any to-dos. I will actually paste the text here for future reference, the comments, so you can come back to this later on from the code, which you can grab from the link in the video description. And once we have all of this done, what can we do with all of these none and some values? Well, we can again use our trusty fold method. And if the none value arrives, that means that our whole list of to-do items holds only valid to-do items. So we are going to return write unit. Why write unit? Well, because our failure or units have the right value being a unit. That's why we return write unit. And in another case, that is when at least one element inside the list of to-do items is invalid, we are going to return that value failure, so left, and let's rename the A parameter to F, so left F. Okay. I know it's tough, and I know that it might currently fry your brain, because it surely did fry mine when I was trying to explain it. It's really something to grasp this bunch of code. But what are we basically doing? We get the KT list of to-do items, and then we extract the failure option from each and every to-do item. Next up, we get only the actual failed to-do items from this list, or we at least try to get only the failed to-do items from that list. And then we basically check, are there any failed to-do items inside the list? If there are, we return left with the value failure present inside of there. If there are none failed to-do items present, we return right unit, which signifies that everything is valid. And then lastly, from this whole chain of short-circuiting validation calls with and then, let's call it like that, we return some if there is a failure, or we return none if there is no failure. And just like that, we have created the ability to validate all of the value objects held inside an entity at once. Be sure to check out the code from the link in the video description, and also, if you are serious about becoming a great Flutter developer who can build real apps for clients or at the job, go to flutter.education. Link is also in the video description to get the top curated Flutter news and resources aimed at improving your app development career. Over there, you can also subscribe to my mailing list to get the best Flutter resources delivered weekly right into your inbox. And if you don't want to miss more tutorials like this, which are for the most part not going to be as intense as this one, be sure to subscribe to this channel and also join the notification squad by hitting the bell button to make sure you grow your Flutter skills, because here on ResoCoder, I am determined to provide you with the best tutorials and resources so that you will become an in-demand Flutter developer. If this video helped you with this sort of a validation and all that, give it a like and also share it with other developers if you want them to fry their brains too. Leave a comment if you have anything to say, and see you in the next video.